Rob Orton sat on his bed at Granny Royce's roadhouse, tasked to perform a wretched deed. Undeath would provide him the means by which to cast the lure. All he had to do to secure his freedom was draw Undeath's next victim to the house. There was one catch to the deal. It had to be Melinda, his own daughter. The reason why escaped Rob. He often had trouble understanding the madness that had befallen him and how he'd wound up at Granny Royce's in the first place. Time was completely irrelevant at this house. But unlike the others who lived here, he could feel it passing. The other residents forgot about time. They told him he would too after a while of being undead, and that he'd forget about the physical pain of being undead as well. But that was just it. Rob Orton was the only resident at Granny Royce's who had no pain, who was, in fact, not undead at all, but still very regrettably alive. And as the years continued on, and he began visibly aging, the others would find this out, and then they'd demand to know why he'd never told them, and how he'd escaped the terrible blow of the dagger and the world of eternal life and eternal pain they called home. God, they'd be pissed. But Undeath never said he had to tell them. He just said he had to lure in Melinda to take his place at Granny Royce's. Then he'd be free. Rob Orton hadn't been afraid to die the bleak and dank morning death came to him. He wasn't against the idea at all. It seemed like it would be a merciful end to the pain of the divorce, of his firing, of being reduced to living in squalor in apartment 44 at quaint little Ridge Sky Place, with its adorable wall rats and 5 varieties of ceiling mold. It happened somewhat like in the cartoons. Death approached Rob politely, hooded and holding his scythe. Rob had just innocently picked up a strange-looking knife he'd seen stuck in a bush just outside his apartment, a 280-square-foot studio on the end of a row of several identical units, all facing a small forest. It was about 5:30 a.m. and he hadn't slept at all. He had a job interview at a gas station in 3 hours. He was skipping it. When Death approached him, floating ghost-like out of the woods, he was strangely unafraid and only mildly surprised. "You're early," Rob said to the mass of black robes as they glided to a halt. He knew almost instantly who it was. He couldn't see any skeleton underneath those robes, seemingly composed of a strange, otherworldly smoke that was somehow emanating a deep crimson glow. But it was Death, all right. He carried his scythe peacefully at his side. Rob wondered when he'd raise it. Maybe he had to kill himself first, like he was thinking about doing tonight. Then the scythe would finish the job, as it were. But as Death began to move a little, Rob became afraid. He raised the knife and pointed it at Death's heart out of instinct. Amazingly, Death recoiled. Beads of sweat appeared on Rob's face. He trembled, seemed ready to cry. He thought he'd wanted to die. How mistaken he was. He wondered how many suicide victims there were in the vast ether of nothingness who'd feel remorse if only they were able. "Fear not," Death said. His voice was oddly soothing and sounded almost human. It was a strange chorus of voices, youthful and elderly, angelic and demonic. But through all the sounds coming from the hole in the hood of the robe, the hint of worry in Death's voice was clear. "The dagger you hold in your hand," Death told Rob calmly, "is the ridiculous dagger." Rob stared at the dark, gaping infinity in Death's hood. Then he looked down at the dagger. Ridiculous wasn't the word he'd used to describe it. He smirked. The dagger looked jagged, large, menacing, but not at all ridiculous. Not to him. He actually thought it was quite impressive in spite of himself. He wondered who'd left it. Perhaps some vandal meaning to slash someone's tires in an act of revenge, cruelty, or boredom before something scared him away. Maybe he'd seen death before Rob did. That sort of thing happened all the time at these apartments. Maybe it was a discarded murder weapon. That wouldn't surprise Rob. The apartments had at least one murder every 2 months or so, and a murder would explain why Death had turned up here. The ridiculous dagger? Rob asked, chuckling. Yes, Death said, almost bitterly. He was pointing at it. Rob saw his hand for the first time. It certainly didn't resemble a skeleton's hand, though it was hard and solid, it appeared. It was ghost white as expected, but apparently not made of bone, nor roughened flesh. Death's hand, rather, seemed to be made of some kind of crystal-like material that crackled like dirt and gravel whenever he moved, sounding almost like a zombie disturbing a gravestone as it pushed its way out of the ground. It is called the ridiculous dagger because it is a tool of ridicule against me. My scythe gives mortals dignity in death when their time comes. That dagger gives mortals a ridiculous parody of life at the time when they should come to rest with me. It is a tool of suffering, a tool of evil. Many mortals have tried to cheat me with it, always with nasty, unforeseen, and undesirable results. Here, Death seemed to shudder. I implore you, he said, sounding almost afraid, to relinquish the dagger. Rob blinked, a sudden explosion of realization in his head. He had something mystical, something no mortal should ever touch, and it was stuck in a bush right outside his door. It was almost funny. He almost didn't believe it. But he was looking straight into the unseen eyes of Death, and Death was scared shitless. He felt powerful. Relinquish the knife? He didn't want to relinquish that knife he'd pointed at Rachel the night she'd shown him the door. Melly sleeping upstairs, Rachel forcing herself not to scream as not to wake her. Remembering this, Rob suddenly found his grip slipping on the ridiculous dagger. He paled, his face knotted up in pain. He remembered Rachel threatening to call the cops if he didn't put that fucking knife down. Eventually, he did put it down gingerly on their kitchen table. And maybe he should put this one down too, place it into Death's cold, gravelly hand, and go quietly like he had on that night long ago. Why is this knife, this dagger thing here? Rob asked, almost disgusted by it. Undeath is sometimes not careful with it, Death said, speaking slowly as to make sure Rob understood everything he said. This is the sort of place he might mark as his territory. Remote, wooded. He loves those sorts of areas. Areas where he can keep his victims trapped, that is. Areas people are unlikely to stumble upon. Rob furrowed his brow. Undeath? He asked. What's undeath? Not what, Death explained, but who. You must realize, my friend, that there are no true dyads in this realm. No, only trinities. Father, Son, Ghost, Heaven, Hell, Purgatory, Dragon, Beast, False Prophet. I'm not so familiar with that last one, but sure. And then there's life, death, and undeath. Rob blinked again. He understood at some level. Everyone has heard of the undead. Zombies, reanimated corpses, that sort of thing. Death's words started making more and more sense. This dagger was a zombie maker, and this being, Undeath, Death's bratty kid brother, or douche frat boy cousin, you might say, liked making zombie farms at spots seldom visited, like crumbly old Ridge Sky Place here in Sketch Central, little slice of green acres. Up the road, there was nothing but dark woods for miles. You could drive for 3 or more hours and see not a soul. This whole area was prime real estate for a zombie farm. I think I get you, Rob finally said. Good, Death said, relieved. A noise like leaves crackling as he extended his arm. Rob stared at the strained, solid hand, prickly and outspread like a large petrified spider stuck on its back. The mortal sighed inwardly and moved to give Death the dagger. An impossibly fast flash of movement and what seemed like a gust of wind. Both Rob and Death jumped. Between them stood some punk in a Halloween costume. Or at least, a punk in a Halloween costume is what he looked like. But his lightning speed gave Rob a hint that this must be Undeath, ridiculous as he appeared. And he was here to reclaim his ridiculous dagger. The punk in the costume searched around frantically before the rubber imitations of a skull's eye sockets finally fell on the dagger in Rob's hand. Undeath gasped. He was dressed in black, blending into the night better than Death, still emanating his glow. His mask, made to look like a skull, stretched when he barked at the mortal. "My dagger!" he spat. "Give it back to me." Rob stared at this rude asshole, dressed like a stereotypical Grim Reaper. It was an appropriate look, given he made a mockery of Death. Undeath belted out again, "Give it to me!" But Rob didn't want to hand it over. He held it close to his chest. He looked at Death for guidance. Death chuckled. "Don't worry, Rob," he said. "He has no power. He can steal any weapon you try to use on him except that dagger. And except my scythe, of course." "Oh, shove it up your ass," Undeath roared at his counterpart. Undeath reached for the dagger, but Rob tightened his grip on it. The punk really couldn't do anything. It was like there was some invisible shield between them. "You have no use for it, mortal," Undeath told Rob threateningly. "Oh, no, it's no use to you." This is like fucking Wizard of Oz, Rob thought. He almost smiled, picturing Undeath as the Wicked Witch after the ruby slippers. But that witch's costume was far better than this asshole's. "Is it true," Rob asked Death, "I can't use this?" "You don't want to use it," Death said, his voice dire. "Death is always preferable, Rob. I think you know that." "Then what do I do with it?" Rob asked. "I'm not about to hand it over to this asshole." "Fuck you," Undeath screamed. Now, Death said, coming closer to Rob and Undeath and speaking like a parent trying to settle a spat between his kids. "Let's calm ourselves. I think I know how to settle this." "Really?" Rob asked. Undeath's mask came up a little, suggesting he was raising an eyebrow skeptically. "Indeed," Death said civilly. "Now, Rob, though Undeath may seem uncouth to you, there's a reason he exists. People often shy away from me, but I certainly have a purpose. Undeath does too. He's just not always good at his job." "Hey, please allow me to finish, dear brother," Death said to Undeath, placing his hand on his shoulder. "I admit I'm not good at my job all the time either. I take people prematurely every day, and I often don't realize my mistake till after the fact." He sighed with apparent deep regret, perhaps remembering a lot of unnecessary sadness he caused. Then he turned to Rob. "Undeath's purpose is one of justice, I must sometimes remind myself. Imperfect justice, but justice nonetheless. The state of being undead is torture. Torture that should be reserved for the most wicked, though my brother here has a habit of being indiscriminate, I'm afraid. Under his mask, Undeath seemed to smile deviously. I personally think hell is enough, Death continued. Of course, I don't know if it's real. I only take those I escort to the Vale. I don't see where they go once they pass through. But I sometimes feel an odd dread when I must escort someone unsavory. That is my only hint there is a hell. My feeling of satisfaction I sometimes get when standing before the Vale tells me there might be a heaven too. I don't know if there's a God. I've never seen him. Though I sometimes suspect he and life, who I know exists, are one and the same. I don't know if there's a devil. Here, he turned his head slowly to face Undeath. But sometimes, dear brother, I suspect you are he. Undeath took it as a compliment. Why, thank you, he said with a little nod, his voice proud and sick and vile. Death nodded. He sighed. And turning to Rob, he said thoughtfully, I believe it might actually be best to return him the dagger. No way, Rob cried. You can't take it? What would I do with it? Death asked. Discard it in another bush? I can't destroy it, sadly, and I've found in the past that if I keep it, it disrupts the powers of my scythe. My scythe can't tolerate it. In fact, whenever it is near that damned thing, it refuses to work. That's why it's so important I leave here as soon as I can. There are many lost souls at this moment waiting for me to gather them up and lead them on their way, but I can't do it with that ridiculous dagger near me. Wherever that dagger is, I stay away. I dare say I sometimes forget entirely the places where Undeath brings his dagger. All the hidden and decaying edifices, caves, tunnels, and glens that the undead call their home. I never venture to these places anymore. There's a fair number of them, but the unlucky people who dwell there can't know me, so I let the memory of them slip away to keep myself sane. Death, to Rob's wonder, seemed to fight back tears. My job isn't fun, he confessed, but it's necessary. And sometimes, when I sense whatever profound goodness is sometimes behind the veil, it's rewarding. But those moments are rare. He sighed. Rob, I've wondered for millennia if there's a place where I could successfully hide that dagger, either in the deepest of seas or the farthest of worlds. But Undeath would eventually find it. I lurk in the shadows. He zooms around everywhere, practically in broad daylight. He'd scour the whole planet in a flash, the whole universe, and he'd find that dagger eventually. You might as well return it to him and hope for the best. You heard him, Undeath cackled triumphantly. Hand it over. Rob could see the menace behind Death's mask, or Undeath's mask. Death could see it too, and he seemed sad for it. It was clear what Undeath would do the second he got his knife back. I just hope he doesn't go for his eye, Rob heard Death mutter bitterly. He always tries to go for the eye. I'll give it back to you, Rob said carefully, staring into Undeath's Halloween mask. If you promise not to do what you're thinking of doing. Undeath laughed mockingly. You think I'm going to use it on you? You planned to, didn't you? Undeath shrugged. I did. And I'll do it. You can't stop me. Now give me the dagger. Don't worry, Death said soothingly to Rob. He put a hand on his shoulder. It was surprisingly warm, like dry soil that had been baking in the sun. He can't hurt you. If he tries to, I'll just take you with me. What's beyond the veil is preferable to what he'd do to you. Undeath shrank back, seemingly intimidated. Then he seemed to pout like a sullen kid who didn't get his way. Rob thought for a moment. Was hell behind that veil for him? He'd been such a monster to his wife, to his daughter. Was hell preferable to being a mangled zombie? Forever? It was hard to say. But Death had a feeling of where each soul would go he'd mentioned. And from how he acted, he seemed confident wherever Rob would go, it would be someplace not too bad. Death abruptly tore his hand away from Rob. He gave a little cry of pain. Undeath's mood seemed to sour even more. He's been touched by life, Death cried. Rob furrowed his brow in confusion. He examined his hand and his arm as if expecting to see some sort of heavenly glow, but nothing. Nonetheless, he'd apparently changed. It seems you are safe, Death chuckled, taking a step back. From both of us. Well, for a time, at least. Rob opened his mouth to speak, but then his eyes caught an amazing sight. The forest in front of them was shifting, coming alive. The sun was beginning to rise. Its light seemed unnaturally bright for so early in the morning. The tree branches rustled in a strong and sudden breeze. The trees themselves seemed to stir, their trunks groaning with slow and effortful movement, as if they were trying to hoist themselves out of the ground. A voice from nowhere suddenly sounded, emanating from seemingly everywhere, but apparently only heard by Rob and his unearthly companions. It was a serene, seemingly female voice, and it had this to announce. Robert Orton will remain unharmed, but for how long I will not divulge. He will go with Undeath and be kept by him for a time. Undeath still has been sorely cheated, and so she, to whom Robert gave me, will be given over to the hands of Undeath, and I and Death shall leave her forever. Then, almost as quickly as it had come to life, the forest became still once more, and the voice faded away, and the sun seemed to mysteriously become a little less bright. Undeath was nodding, considering everything the voice had said. Seems a little fair, he had to admit, now seeming satisfied. Life is always a little fair. That was life? Rob asked, bewildered. Why, yes, Death confirmed, and life has spoken. You must go with Undeath, my friend, and you'll be trapped with him for a time, but unharmed. And now Undeath must take your daughter, because he was cheated from taking you. What? Rob cried. Melly was by no means a brilliant mind like her mother, he had to admit, but she was hardly deserving of Undeath. She wasn't a bad person, not by a long shot. This was outrageous. What sense does that make? Who makes these rules? Life does, Death said matter-of-factly. And yes, the rules, as you call them, often are quite arbitrary. It makes me doubt that life is indeed God, as I sometimes suspect. Well, life or God or whoever is being unfair, Melinda has nothing to do with any of this. She's just trying to get through life. She doesn't always make smart choices, but she doesn't deserve this. She's not evil or anything. People often don't deserve it, Undeath hissed evilly. He chuckled. But you know, that's life. Rob sagged. Couldn't you take my brother Don? Don was a real idiot of the family and a complete jackass. He had to often talk down to Melinda, though she wasn't nearly as dumb as him. No, Death said, shaking his head. No, I'm afraid you never gave life to Don. Life specifically stated it must be your child, the one you brought to life. Rob couldn't believe it. Maybe he was being punished after all. Finally, this was the consequence of what he'd done 30-odd years ago. Rachel was asleep. He'd arrived home late for their first little apartment, not unlike the one he lived in now, completely wasted out of his mind. He forced himself upon her, though she didn't want it. She couldn't resist. He was too strong. But she forgave him. God, the woman was too forgiving for her own good. He'd truly been sorry, but Rachel was reminded of his deed every day when she saw Melinda. She could never forget it. Truly, life, that weird angelic voice from the forest, was God, because this was divine justice, if he ever saw it. "Wish to take anything with you before you go?" Death asked Rob. Undeath stood there, waiting. The sun was shining, birds were chirping. Rob briefly wondered if anyone could see the two ghastly beings before him in the sunlight. Then he turned and went inside apartment 44 to see what possessions of his remained. Some magazines on the floor, near the corner where he slept. Nighttime reading material he'd stolen from a rack at some store, along with some soap and a toothbrush. He briefly read the titles: Mademoiselle, Blue Book, The New Country Life, Arts and Architecture. Maybe they'd distract him. He had an unspecified amount of time to spend as Undeath's prisoner, after all. He scooped them up. When he went back inside, he found Death fading away, waving goodbye. And then, in a flash, he was carried away by Undeath, who laughed with sick glee as he transported them both to Granny Royce's. Rob shivered. He didn't know how long it would take before Melinda would meet her demise, and all this time he stayed at Granny Royce's, he wondered how he might save her. He tried to find some escape in his magazines, but he ended up leaving them on the table in the house's admissions area. His daughter was all he could think about for all this time. He wondered if Melinda even still thought about him. She hated him. Surely she had witnessed the abuse that went on in that house, despite Rachel's efforts to conceal it. And now she'd have to pay for what he did, even though she'd done nothing wrong. Oh, how he longed to take that truly ridiculous dagger in her place. But there was no changing life's decree. He didn't know how much time had passed since he was first welcomed into the house by Granny Royce. But he knew Undeath had chosen today to add Melinda to his collection. He could feel it. It was approaching 9 at night. He could feel Undeath making his way toward the house from outside. Oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God. Rob was shaking. His room at Granny Royce's was more spacious than his little apartment his landlord doubtless was curious to find abandoned that morning Undeath whisked him away. Still, this house seemed so small, so entrapping. Its walls, adorned with wallpaper covered in images of trees and flowers, began caving in, it seemed. Oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God, he pled, now beginning to cry. Only God could stop this. But would he? Rob remembered telling Granny he was a traveling minister when he first arrived. It's all he could think of. Who randomly approaches remote, strange-looking houses carrying literature? He said the magazines were religious, except Mormon missionaries and the like. The next day, he lied to Calvin and Granny, saying Undeath, whom they only knew as him, stabbed him with the dagger when he dared leave the house before sunrise. He didn't show them his non-existent wound because, as Granny liked to say, no one should have to see something like that. He called himself Miles Standish. He thought that was a name of a minister from a time long past. Maybe it was one of the pilgrims. He couldn't remember. Maybe he'd called himself a minister as a form of penance to get on God's good side so he'd spare Melinda. It didn't work. Undeath was standing right behind him, having opened the window behind the bed and crawled inside. For this occasion, he'd removed his costume. Rob Orton had called the devil an asshole. Oh, how he regretted it now. For Undeath could be no one but the devil, and in spite of himself, Rob Orton feared the devil, who stood behind him, and whose true image Rob could see out of the corner of his eye, though he dared not turn around to get a full look. The stench, that rotting stench, those eyes drilling into his back, those burning eyes which were bright and dazzling like the fires of a furnace. Something scraped the wood of the floor. The talons, the jet black talons sinking into the floor just next to the bed where he sat shaking with intense and relentless fright. Rob tried not to look. He shut his eyes when he caught a glimpse of the mangled, deep red flesh, tearing and snapping horribly whenever the devil moved, yet somehow keeping its shape. He heard a great sound like dragon wings spreading, ready to take flight. Maybe that's how he moved so fast. He wasn't so pathetic looking without his Halloween costume. And at last Rob understood why he did what he did. He wanted everyone to live as he did. In pain, mangled, burned from his fall from heaven into the pits of hell. Death was a fool to be so uncertain about it. Hell, no doubt, was very, very real. And whether Granny Royce's roadhouse or hell was worse, he couldn't quite tell. Who knew? Perhaps Granny Royce's was hell. Wherever the devil was, hell was too. The ring of a telephone in his ear. "You're calling her," hissed the devil, snake-like. "She's about to pick up." The sound was only in Rob's head, but indeed Melinda was really being called by some preternatural means. The devil had made it so, though there were no phones at Granny Royce's. Mr. Norris was shuffling past in the hallway outside. His crying was especially loud tonight. Years and years of undeath, and he still couldn't get over it. Rob thought of Miss Tilly's baby, chewing on her intestines and sloshing about in her massive wound, endlessly wondering why life had abandoned her and why death had never found her, even after all this time. Perhaps she thought death would come one day. She was a smart baby, always looking on the bright side. How stupid she was. Death was nowhere here, nowhere to be found. It would be a while before Rob saw him again. Melinda picked up the phone. "Hello?" "Let her get lost," Rob silently begged God. "Let her get lost. Let her hit a tree." Mr. Norris's crying grew even louder. He was practically wailing. Rob himself was nearly sobbing. "I need you, Melly," he uttered. "Please come now." He said just that, and then the line went dead.